So today I'm going to interview Mr. Peter James Thompson. Hi, Mr. Thompson.
Hi.
What kind of motivated you to pursue a career in law and also relocating in Hong Kong to practice law?
Okay, well, I originally went to university to study history, but then my elder brother studied law at the University of Hull, so I decided to follow him. But I'd always wanted the idea of travelling somewhere or other. When I eventually got the job in Hong Kong, I thought I would stay for about 2 years and then move on to particularly to the States. But here I am 57 years later, haven't moved at all.
That's great. If you hadn't done law and followed your brother's footsteps, kind of what would you think that you would pursue as a career?
Difficult to know. I mean, there wasn't, in the late 50s in England, there wasn't that much going around.
Yeah.
There was free education, of course, which was excellent. But as far as jobs was concerned, not that many. Probably it would have to have been teaching, I would have thought.
Yeah, that's great. How was the trip to Hong Kong and kind of what were the first impressions of Hong Kong you had?
Well, I travelled on a BOAC Comet, which stopped 5 times on the way to Hong Kong, unlike the non-stop flight we have these days. It seemed to take forever. It stopped at Rome, Istanbul, Bombay and Rangoon.
Yes.
And I think I mentioned here that when I first saw the Burmese ladies in their longi sarongs, I thought that I was heading in the right direction.
That's great. Yeah. And what was the first kind of impression you had for Hong Kong? Was it? I imagine it would be very, very different from what it is now.
It was pretty boring, I suppose. I once asked our senior partner, Nig Nigel, the guy who hired me, had Hong Kong been interesting in the 1930s and the post-war period. He said, good God, no, it was as dull as ditch water. However, the Beatles had arrived in Hong Kong just before I did, and so did the London Symphony Orchestra.
Yes.
So things were beginning to happen as the 60s. This is 1964 we're talking about. And I think there was a much diminished sort of colonial attitude in the mid to late 60s when it was known as the territory rather than the colony. And I remember one Chinese girl saying that it seemed that a different sort of Englishman was coming to Hong Kong. And up to that time, not many English people went out with or married Chinese. In a relatively short time, this changed completely. By the 80s and 90s, most of the British partners of JSM were married to Asians, except in the case of Simon Yip, where the position was reversed. Some colonial attitudes did linger, however. A short while after I arrived, Nig Nigel asked me to review the bylaws of the Helena May, the so-called Virgin's Retreat on Garden Road. I knew this institution didn't take Asian girls as members because a Chinese-Vietnamese girlfriend of mine educated at the Sorbonne had applied and been refused. I said to Nig that I preferred not to do this work. I suppose he could have sacked me on the spot, but he graciously gave the job to someone else.
You mentioned that you like to travel a lot, and I suppose that this your practice in maritime law kind of gave you that opportunity to do it, right?
Yeah, I was very lucky to be thrown into maritime work in the early years. Our principal client, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, known to everybody as the bank, had some shipping loans which had gone wrong. So I set about trying to arrest the defaulting ships. Willie Purvis, then chief accountant, i.e. the lending officer in those days, seemed to appreciate my dashing around, and we've remained firm friends over a period of 50 years. He was, I suppose, my mentor in Hong Kong, and of course became chairman of HSBC Holdings in London. It was a good time to get involved in shipping, as our owners, nearly all Shanghainese, had started to build new ships in Japan, having previously operated second-hand tonnage. This resulted in a lot of legal work, both for owners and the banks who lent them money. One of the most interesting things I had to do was in 1969, when I was required to fly to South Vietnam to investigate the seizing of a client's vessel in the Saigon River and determine whether the seizure was according to judicial process or an arbitrary act by some high-ranking officer in the South Vietnamese army. Landing at Thompson Air Base was quite an introduction to the war that was raging in and around the Vietnamese capital at the time. The airbase was crammed with military planes, vehicles, weapons, munitions, and the shelling and bombing could be heard from my hotel room in the Caravel Hotel. I was assisted in making local contacts by some American war correspondent friends who spent some of their time in Hong Kong, and I got to know them well. And on the legal side, by an elderly French lawyer, Maître Lambert, in the process of asking questions and determining that the seizure of the ship by an Arvin colonel who was no lawyer, was in fact not, in my opinion, according to judicial process. I was feeling quite uncomfortable about this and had the feeling I was being watched and not trusted as an outsider and could be accused at any time of spying. Anyway, in a long and detailed telex when back in Hong Kong, which was subsequently read out in the High Court in London and which formed the basis of JSM's client's claim, the court found for the client, but the ruling was overturned on appeal. But what an adventure it was.
That's great.
Then in 1968, I'd been forced to take a circuitous route to get to Madras in India, where one of another client's ships had broken in half against the sea wall. At the time, the east coast of India was flooded, necessitating a flight first to Calcutta, then up to Karachi, down to Colombo, and finally up to Madras.
What aspects of being a lawyer have you find most fulfilling, and kind of why?
Well, certainly doing maritime work was the most fulfilling thing I think I could possibly have done. I really enjoyed it very much, and it allowed me to branch out into other things. For instance, I was chairman of the Hong Kong Port and Maritime Board from the 1st of June 1998 to the 31st of May 2000, having previously been chairman of its predecessor, the Port Development Board. Easily one of the most interesting things something that I'm very proud of was working on the new shipping registry, the Hong Kong Shipping Registry, while I was chairman of the Port and Maritime Board. Together with my partner Dan Bradshaw, we set about this, setting up this registry, and it went on to be the fourth largest in the world. In the process, flags of convenience for locally flagged vessels were rendered more or less obsolete, although they still appear in the harbour, with the board being able to successfully lobby government to do away with tax on shipping profits.
Do you have more to add on that?
Well, another one of the maritime exercises occurred in the early 80s when it became necessary to seek out a flag of convenience. This was before the setting up of the Hong Kong Shipping Registry, that would be acceptable to China. Liberia and Panama were deemed politically unacceptable as their governments recognized Taiwan. The search involved a trip to Cyprus and a sojourn in Panama, which was curtailed by a typhoon. A most effective firm of shipping lawyers in Panama helped JSM greatly in the exercise. Eventually, both Liberia and Panama were accepted by Beijing anyway. But in the process, I learned a lot about Panamanian and Liberian shipping law.
You mentioned you kind of stumbled upon kind of maritime law. Was it like a choice of yours to get into that area, or was it more like a coincidence?
No, our senior partner, Nick Nigel, had dabbled with shipping law.
Yes.
And it needed somebody to be doing it full time. So when I was hired in 1964, he put me into it there and then.
Wow.
Let me get on with it, basically.
So you kind of just learn it on the job in a sense.
Sort of did, yeah.
That's great. I understand that you were a senior partner at JSM from 1985 to 1989 and was with the firm for kind of 20 years. Would
29
you mind,
years.
29 years, yeah, actually, yeah. Would you mind sharing kind of what made you leave the comfort zone and move to another firm afterwards?
I guess that I'd been doing what I had been doing, the sort of practice that I had for quite a long time, and you know, it was quite a relief to have the idea of doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was really the answer.
It's more exciting and
Yeah,
new opportunities.
New opportunities, yeah.
That's right. You described to me the changes in the past 50 years in the area of maritime law.
Well, as far as Hong Kong was concerned, it was the establishment of this independent shipping register. And prior to that, Hong Kong ships were deemed to be British ships and had to be registered on a very, very complicated system. Unless, of course, you got rid of that altogether and used the flags of convenience, mostly Liberia and Panama. You could set up a Liberian or Panamanian company and register your ships under that, and that was an offshore operation and didn't attract tax in Hong Kong. But it was pretty cumbersome, and so we decided that you know, we should have our own independent shipping registry. And Dan Bradshaw and I took the best bits from the old British registry and the best bits from the flags of convenience registries and amalgamated them into a very workable operation, which was tax-free as well, of course, thank goodness.
Can you tell us some of your kind of career milestones, other than the kind of the public work that you've done, or that if there are any kind of other interesting deals or challenges that you have met during your career?
Well, some of the things that I was proudest of being involved in my time there were, one, helping the firm to grow from being a relatively small Hong Kong firm with about a dozen lawyers in 1964 to become internationally recognized and capable of taking on the best. And secondly, to establish the association with Norton Rose from the City of London in the mid-70s. This gave the firm access to City of London expertise. And David Shaw, one of the best lawyers I've ever come across, and was later advisor to the board of HSBC Holdings in London, spent many years with JSM.
Yes. So kind of, what do you think contributed to the success of kind of building JSM from a very small firm to an internationally recognized firm?
Well, for a start off, we increased in size.
Of course.
Took on many
Yes.
more lawyers. And I think we were all, you know, reasonably, I wouldn't say we're necessarily of the same standard as the City of London or of Wall Street, but we were pretty good, I think, at doing what we did. And we had some extremely good clients, such as the bank and Swires and others. When I mentioned earlier about helping the firm to grow from being a relatively small Hong Kong firm to being internationally recognized, I should mention the merger with the firm of Rutten and Stewart in 1973-74.
Of course.
Where I met John Payne and Robin Peard, two partners of that firm, in a bar in Wan Chai. And we sat and talked and drank quite a lot, or John Payne and I drank quite a lot. And eventually we agreed on a sort of merger of the two firms. We, as a result of that, gained two extremely good lawyers. And it was an association which worked extremely well. I guess it was a merger rather than an association. And then the association with Norton Rose was initiated around 1975 by me, thinking that it would be a good idea to have this association with a London firm. They dispatched a delegation of Hong Kong partners to continue the discussion, and altogether it beefed up the firm's corporate side and increased all-round capability in dealing with commercial clients. They also had a big shipping reputation, although there was never the need for them to send any shipping lawyers to Hong Kong. And among the Norton Rose lawyers to serve in Hong Kong were David Lewis, who became senior partner in London and later Lord Mayor of London as Sir David Lewis, and Roger Birkby, who became managing partner.
Can you kind of tell us some of the challenges or interesting aspects about you kind of practicing law in Hong Kong as the British were contemplating and negotiating the exit? And then there were a lot of things going on, like Vietnam War, Cultural Revolution, and that sort of stuff. What kind of issues do you think we're facing at this time?
I'm not sure that there are any issues arising out of the end of Hong Kong being a colony. No, I'm sure that there are no particular challenges arising out of that. I mean, during the 60s, of course, the Vietnam War was going on, and I had several friends who were war correspondents who would be coming in and out of Vietnam and who would give us a rundown on the Vietnam War and how it was going. And then, of course, the Cultural Revolution in the mid 60s.
Yes.
I was one of the last tourists to visit Canton in, I think, 1966. The Cultural Revolution had already started at the time, and Canton was full of Red Guards. In fact, all about this high. They were all very young indeed, and they were in schoolrooms and churches and halls and that sort of thing, all piling together. But of course, it hadn't turned against Britain at that time, and whenever we appeared, there would be fantastic clapping and so on, and we were treated in the most wonderful way. There were just the three of us, one of my colleagues and an Australian dentist, and we had this huge big Humber car to ourselves with a guide and a driver. That was through China Travel Service, and I think that those trips stopped very soon after that.
Yes.
And it was a problem with the Cultural Revolution was certainly a problem. I was on my first leave back in England for some of the time that it was on there, and I remember saying to Nick Nigel, do you think it's okay if I come back again? Is it going to be all right? He said, oh, we've been through sort of worse things than this, including him being incarcerated by the Japanese during the war and that sort of thing. So I was back like a shot. I'd like to talk about my work for government over the years, if we could.
Of course.
I think I mentioned that I was chairman of the Port and Maritime Board, having previously been chairman of the Port Development Board, and I'd been a member of the Port Development Board since its inception in 1990 until 2000, and served as chairman of its midstream operations and its Lantau Port Liaison Group. I was vice chairman of the Hong Kong Shipowners Association for 8 years, and I've mentioned I was a member of the steering group which advised the government on the establishment of the new Hong Kong Shipping Registry. And probably the most important work I did for government was sitting on the Public Service Commission, which advises on the civil service, and I think I was on that for over 10 years, I think. And I think as a result of that, I was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, on the strength of that. And in 2001, the Hong Kong government awarded me a Silver Bohemia Star for, quote, for his significant contribution in promoting Hong Kong as an international maritime centre and a leading port in the world. In particular, his work as chairman of the Port and Maritime Board. So it was really those things. On the sort of more artistic side, I was on the council of the Hong Kong Academy of Performing Arts for 10 years, and on the council of the Hong Kong International Arts Festival for about 10 years as well. So really, I was quite busy during those days.
Yes. I understand that you were serving as a member of the Law Society Committee, which is now known as Council. Can you share a bit about that kind of work back then?
Yeah, I was the assistant solicitor member on the committee in the mid to late 60s. And I found it very interesting indeed. The highlight was attending the centenary of the New Zealand Law Association in 1969, I think, where T.S. Lowe, who was probably chairman at the time, or president rather, president or chairman, whatever, we both went together, and it was the most interesting trip imaginable, and fantastic hospitality from the New Zealand lawyers. And then, of course, I had to step down when I became a partner in 1970. I stepped down as the assistant solicitor.
So you mentioned being the chairman of the Port Maritime Board and various other government boards.
Yes.
Would you recommend solicitors of this day and age to do kind of similar public service work, and how should they go about doing it?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely essential that, because of the training that lawyers have, that they should involve themselves in public service work. I mean, I can give you a rundown of the various bodies that I served on, but I think it's quite easy to make it known to government that one would like to serve in this manner. Not a problem, I think.
That's right.
And they're quite, they'll be very happy to take people on board.
So talk about like Hong Kong growing over the years. So what do you think are some of the biggest challenges you have, or biggest changes that you have seen in Hong Kong legal market over the course of your career?
Certainly when I first arrived, there were a lot of people living on hillsides and that sort of thing, and a lot of quite poor people. And quite quickly, the building program really was accelerated. Eventually, you sort of had a middle class emerging who took foreign holidays, and just generally, there was an upsurge in people's livelihoods. That happened particularly during the 70s and 80s. And I think that was a marvelous thing. There's not all that many countries in the world where something like that happened, I think. And it was due to the enlightened policy of the Hong Kong government. How
is Hong Kong kind of relevant, and how will it, do you think, remain relevant in spite of the fierce competition from the other kind of regional legal and financial hubs? And what roles do lawyers have to play to ensure that it remains relevant?
I think they have to do everything possible to promote the rule of law and an independent judiciary. You've probably noticed that the idea of foreign judges sitting in our Court of Final Appeal has come under pressure from some sources, and I think it's absolutely essential that continues to happen. It was one of the best things that came out of the joint declaration with China. And it's amazing in a way that China agreed to that every single time the CFA sits, there's a foreign judge sitting there with all the expertise and experience of a common law judge.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson, for your time. It's a great interview, and I learned much more about you after this interview. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much.